From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It's a new year, and the Prime Minister had been hoping for a new start.
Today, I welcome a new agreement that will expand the relationship between the NHS and the private healthcare sector.
But it wasn't the NHS that everyone was talking about. The political agenda had been hijacked before Parliament had even returned, all because of one man furiously typing into his phone on the other side of the Atlantic.
Do you have any reaction, Prime Minister, to a post by Elon Musk this morning suggesting that America should liberate Britain from a tyrannical government?
And on Elon Musk, I do need to ask you this.
Forgive me for going back on Musk's attacks. I'm afraid I must ask also about the grooming gang scandal.
Elon Musk's manic flurry of wild tweets had attacked British democracy, prime ministers past and present, and accused the safeguarding minister of being a rape genocide apologist.
We've seen this playbook many times, whipping up of intimidation and threats of violence. But when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed.
But despite the anger at Musk's attacks, within hours, the Home Secretary was announcing a new policy on grooming gangs.
This government is determined to act, strengthening the law, taking forward recommendations from independent inquiries, supporting stronger police action and protection for victims.
The story today is Elon Musk dictating the British political agenda.
I'm Aubrey Allegretti, and I'm the Times' chief political correspondent.
Aubrey, what's the mood like in Westminster at the start of this new year?
I think any hopes of the season of goodwill continuing to drip into January and hopes of a slightly calmer start to the year have been completely swept aside by a row which has become frenetic, messy, bitter, angry. And all of this really boils down to a very messy web of half-truths, truths, in some cases disinformation and in some cases misinformation. And it's against that backdrop that we are trying to navigate a really difficult subject, which is really important to hundreds of child sexual abuse victims, but which politicians and senior US figures like Elon Musk are trying to preside over.
And Aubrey, you've reported from Westminster for years. How weird a moment is this to sort of see the political weather being dictated by somebody who doesn't even live here?
It still seems strange to us, but it isn't completely unprecedented. And actually, the manner in which Elon Musk is acting is very reminiscent of the way that Westminster journalists were completely captivated by every single word that Donald Trump used to tweet out during his 4 years in office from 2017 to 2021 in the White House. And it's a very similar MO to what we're now seeing from Elon Musk. He is tweeting through the night UK time, US time. His attacks sometimes seem to come out of nowhere, and they can occasionally be very sort of visceral and ferocious.
So take us back to where all of this has started. Why is Elon Musk so obsessed with what's happening in the UK? Why does he even care?
It's really interesting. I mean, Elon Musk was born in South Africa, but he has a grandmother, Cora Amelia Robinson, who was from Liverpool. And I think the first mention that we really get from Elon Musk about his sort of knowledge of the UK was 13 years ago, where he tweeted, "I really like Britain." And that was after a visit to Oxford when he'd been enjoying a trip around the country, including during the Olympics on a Boris bike in London. He said that he admired Margaret Thatcher after her death and said that she was much like his English nana. And he even described himself as being from a British English background, not an Afrikaner background. So his affinity to the UK has existed for quite some time. And indeed, he was brought into the fold at a very senior level when he was invited to do a slightly strange-looking fireside chat with Rishi Sunak when the former Prime Minister was hosting this AI conference. And it seemed as though the sort of relations then were quite cordial, but they have significantly deteriorated since.
Yeah, I can't imagine that happening anytime soon. I mean, in the meantime, I suppose we should also say it feels like Elon Musk has been on a bit of a political journey.
Absolutely. He, I think back in 2014, described himself as half Democrat, half Republican, socially liberal and fiscally conservative. He has a scattered voting history, having backed Hillary Clinton, once admitted to voting for Barack Obama, and then since has donated a huge amount to the Donald Trump campaign. In the 2024 election cycle, it was estimated to be up to $277 million. And in the weeks after Donald Trump became president-elect, appointing Elon Musk to this very senior position, effectively a sort of government efficiency role, which is looking to scale back a lot of public spending in the US and find waste. And so he has obviously been on a bit of a journey. And one of the more sort of interesting personal points of that, according to interviews he's given and a recent biography, is the transition of one of his children from male to female. That child subsequently decided to cut him off from her life. And it does appear to be one of the moments where he becomes less socially liberal.
So he's been drifting further to the right, turned into a massive supporter of Trump, is going to be part of the administration. When did he decide to wade in to UK politics? How does he go from a pleasant fireside chat with Rishi Sunak to now stirring up the cauldron to the point where some people are accusing him of undermining British democracy?
He seems borderline obsessed, not just with the UK, but with its leadership as well. And we saw this most evidently over the summer when riots were sparked in the wake of the Southport murders. And in the immediate aftermath of that, misinformation was being amplified online about the attacker. An incorrect name was being spread on X alongside claims that they had come to the UK on a small boat or was Muslim or Syrian. And that led to the local police force criticising people for sharing the incorrect information. Keir Starmer even told large social media companies and those that run them that violent disorder clearly whipped up online, that is also a crime. It's happening on your premises and the law must be upheld everywhere. Elon Musk just replied with one word, which said insane. But it was really the first point where misinformation being amplified on X came into direct conflict with the UK police forces and the UK government.
And that just seems to have been even more amplified now. In the meantime, he's gone from cordial relationship with Rishi Sunak, real anger for Keir Starmer, to a sort of budding friendship, we thought, with Nigel Farage. Tell us about how that happened.
Absolutely. Well, it's no secret that Nigel Farage has been keen to paint himself as a close friend of Donald Trump's for many years, stretching back indeed to the incoming president's first stint in the White House. And so the closer into Donald Trump's orbit Elon Musk has been drawn, that is what has introduced and brought closer Elon Musk to Nigel Farage. And indeed, because of Elon Musk's sort of obsessive interest in UK politics, he has talked quite openly about offering sums of money to reform. But
we were hearing about extraordinary figures, a potential £100 million donation.
Certainly, and Nigel Farage even went over to the US with Nick Candy, who is the husband of Holly Valance and a former Conservative Party donor who's now switched his support to Reform and become the party's new treasurer. They held this amazing meeting in Mar-a-Lago in Florida, pictured together under a portrait of Donald Trump. So it looked like all the stars were aligning really for the successful Republican Trumpism force to try and replicate what it had done in America in the UK.
So we have this growing relationship between Elon Musk and the Reform Party. But in his political journey, his drift even further to the right, he seems to have shifted allegiances a little to a man he brought back to Twitter, Tommy Robinson. Tell us a bit about him, because he's not a figure who often comes up in Westminster coverage.
Tommy Robinson is a name that has been associated for many years with the far right. He was leader of the English Defence League, a movement which grew up during the late 2000s and early 2010s and harboured mostly anti-immigrant and Islamophobic sentiment at a time when concern about immigration was less mainstream. Since then, Tommy Robinson, whose real name, I should add, is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, sought to present himself as a kind of campaigner against grooming gangs. He's tried to present himself as a journalist and documentary maker to highlight these issues. But he also has a sort of CV littered with criminal convictions, and he's currently in prison for contempt of court. And when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he, as you said, reinstated Tommy Robinson and actually Katie Hopkins' accounts as well. And Musk seems to have become a fan of Tommy Robinson, seeing him as this sort of political prisoner whose jailing amounts to an affront to the principle of free speech. And Elon Musk continually tweets about him. He said, "Why is Tommy Robinson in a solitary confinement prison for telling the truth? He should be freed, and those who covered up this travesty should take his place in that cell." So there is a sort of a splintering in the relationship between Nigel Farage and Elon Musk when it comes to Tommy Robinson, because Tommy Robinson is very clearly a sort of far-right figure who Nigel Farage feels would alienate traditional Conservative voters from the Reform Party. And so to make Reform a sort of palatable enough party to millions of normal voters in the UK, Nigel Farage is having to put a very clear blue water between himself and Tommy Robinson, which was much to the chagrin of Elon Musk.
Well, tell us about that.
So this all came to a head really over the weekend when Nigel Farage was pressed repeatedly on the BBC about Tommy Robinson.
But have you or anyone in your team said to Elon Musk that his calls for Tommy Robinson to be released from prison, a convicted offender, somebody on the far right who you yourself worked very hard to distance yourself from, have you told him that he's wrong about that?
I think you're missing the point. The point is the fact that he supports me politically and supports reform doesn't mean I have to agree with every single statement he makes on X.
And then within 24 hours, Elon Musk was tweeting that he didn't think Nigel Farage was right to lead Reform UK.
The tech billionaire Elon Musk has dropped his support for the leader of Reform UK. Writing on his social media platform X, he said the party needs a new leader because Nigel Farage doesn't have what it takes.
And then Farage was forced to sort of clarify things, to try and smooth things over by saying that this was due to a difference of opinion about Tommy Robinson. So it seems as though Nigel Farage isn't backing down from his distancing of Tommy Robinson.
This does feel like it's become a story that is littered with mis and disinformation. So just talk us through Tommy Robinson and why he's in jail, because it does feel like this is something, as you said, that Elon Musk keeps coming back to, sees him as a real sort of fighter for free speech. But what is his contempt of court about?
Well, Tommy Robinson is currently serving an 18-month sentence in jail after admitting contempt of court by repeating false claims against a Syrian refugee, but he has multiple other convictions against his name, most notably in 2018 for a case involving a grooming gang. He live streamed from outside a court where there were reporting restrictions to protect the process, and that almost collapsed the trial, and he was convicted for that as well.
So rather than ensuring justice for the victims of these grooming gangs, he almost let the entire trial process end without any kind of conclusion.
That's right.
Feels like Elon Musk might not really understand the complexity of why Tommy Robinson is behind bars.
No, although Elon Musk takes a very sort of avid and almost like granular interest in UK politics. But I don't think anyone thinks that Elon Musk has sort of followed the granular details of each of these cases.
So, having watched all of these Tommy Robinson films, having seen him back on Twitter and clearly followed him, around New Year, Musk started tweeting himself about this grooming scandal. Just take a step back. How did the scandal actually come to light, and when? Take us back to the start.
Well, the sort of point at which this captures national attention is September 2012, when a journalist, Andrew Norfolk, published an article in The Times based on a police report about the extent of grooming of young girls by Asian men in several sort of northern towns. And it revealed, this article, that children in Rotherham were being abused on an unprecedented scale by networks of mainly British Pakistani men. And some of them were as young as 11 years old. And it really became clear that a similar story was being replicated in towns and cities across the country. The offences went unprosecuted, despite police and child protection agencies in Rotherham having had knowledge of some of these crimes for decades, it was reported at the time. And Rotherham Council went on to produce a 2014 report into abuse in Rotherham, which was led by Alexis Jay, which conservatively estimated that 1,400 children had been targeted between 1997 and 2013. That then led to the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse starting in 2015, also led by the same Professor Alexis Jay. Now, that national inquiry was far more far-reaching, saying that it was going to consider whether public bodies and other non-state institutions had taken seriously their duty of care to protect children from child sexual abuse. And during the inquiry, there were over 6,000 survivors who gave testimony. We think that it cost about £186 million in total.
Wow.
And it did an incredibly thorough job, ending up describing the sexual abuse of children as an epidemic that leaves tens of thousands of victims in its poisonous wake. There were 20 recommendations that were made at the time, but as yet, none have been implemented.
So, Aubrey, there have been multiple reports at local level and then a huge national report, which took years of work, reported back in 2022. Elon Musk, when he talks about this having been covered up, he often points a finger at Keir Starmer in particular. Why does he single him out?
Well, Musk couldn't almost have been more full-throated in why he is personally attacking Keir Starmer. He tweeted that the Prime Minister was, in his words, complicit in the rape of Britain when he was head of the Crown Prosecution Service. Musk said Starmer must go and he must face charges for his complicity in the worst mass crime in the history of Britain. And so obviously what Elon Musk is drawing attention to here was Keir Starmer's role as Director of Public Prosecutions between 2008 and 2013. And Elon Musk basically is alleging that he was part of some sort of cover-up. Now, this could be because he was obviously in that very senior role in 2009 when there was a decision made not to prosecute a gang of perpetrators in Rochdale. But that didn't necessarily come under Keir Starmer's remit, so it's not even clear if he knew about this decision.
Aubrey, over the last few days, anyone who's ventured onto X has probably found themselves in the middle of what feels like a mob being whipped up. Amid all of the whirlwind of accusations around this story, Elon Musk has been tweeting quite a lot about one minister in particular, Jess Phillips. Tell us about that.
That really seems to have been the start of this rolling snowball that has continued to gather steam. And Jess Phillips is the Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding, but she has a long history working with domestic abuse victims and charities in a really sort of frontline role before she entered politics. So she is somebody who I don't think many people would question her commitment to victims. However, there was a letter that sort of emerged onto Twitter in the last few weeks where she denied a request from Oldham Council to carry out a national inquiry into grooming gangs in the town. Now, instead, Jess Phillips proposed a local inquiry like those that have taken place in Rotherham and Telford. And it was that sparked this backlash of outrage and prompted Elon Musk to wade in, calling for a national inquiry and even directly calling Jess Phillips a rape genocide apologist.
Very quickly after this barrage of attacks started on X, the Tory leader, Kemi Badenoch, came out echoing Elon Musk's call for a national inquiry.
She certainly did. And Kemi Badenoch was Women's Minister at the time of Alexis Jay's national inquiry being published. And so there are, I think, some questions for the Conservatives about why they didn't implement the 20 recommendations in Alexis Jay's report during the period they were in office. And there is some scepticism about the sort of moral high ground from which they can claim to talk about on this.
And Aubrey, just stepping back for a moment, as you said, there's already been a national inquiry. There were local ones. We're now getting lots of calls for another national inquiry. Elon Musk, having taken on this cause, tweeted up a storm over the weekend. By Monday morning, just describe, for people who hadn't seen it, what his X feed was looking like.
I mean, Elon Musk was really managing from the other side of the Atlantic and in the middle of the night to set the political agenda in the UK. And his attacks on both Jess Phillips and Keir Starmer were escalating to such a point that he at one point posted a poll suggesting that America should liberate the people of Britain from their tyrannical government and pinned it to the top of his Twitter feed. And so this was turning into something much bigger than a row about grooming gangs and more into Donald Trump, sort of right-hand man and the world's richest man, trying to agitate and instigate what almost sounds like an insurrection. Just 6 months after the general election, where Keir Starmer was obviously elected democratically with a significant majority.
So Aubrey, Keir Starmer was forced, really, to address this in a press conference on Monday morning. You were watching closely. What did you make of what he said?
It was really interesting because Keir Starmer was asked one question initially about Elon Musk and he sort of batted it away. He tried to give the impression that he was reluctant to be drawn into the argument. But then when he was pressed a second time, he gave this incredibly long and I think very emotional answer.
I enjoy the cut and thrust of politics, the robust debate that we must have. But that's got to be based on facts and truth, not on lies. Not on those who are so desperate for attention that they're prepared to debase themselves and their country.
And throughout this, Keir Starmer didn't name Elon Musk. He continued to call X Twitter throughout. And he gave his sort of most...
Small victories.
Exactly. He gave his most critical assessment of Elon Musk and his attempts to interfere in British politics. He criticised lies and misinformation over child sexual exploitation, which had been spread over social media. Now, the closest he came to pinning blame on an individual was actually Kemi Badenoch as leader of the opposition.
What I won't tolerate is politicians jumping on the bandwagon simply to get attention, when those politicians sat in government for 14 long years, tweeting, talking, but not doing anything about it, now so desperate for attention that they're amplifying what the far right is saying.
But that sort of led to follow-up questions about whether or not he was suggesting that anybody who was calling for another national inquiry into this was far right.
Because despite Keir Starmer's criticism for a man he wouldn't even name in the press conference on Monday morning, later that day, the Home Secretary came to the Commons and made an announcement.
She certainly did. She said that those who cover up or fail to report child sexual abuse could face professional or criminal sanctions.
First, I can confirm we will make it mandatory to report abuse, and we will put the measures in the Crime and Policing Bill that will be put before Parliament this spring, making it an offence with professional and criminal sanctions to fail to report or cover up child sexual abuse.
Now, that proposal was one of 20 recommendations made by Alexis Jay, but we certainly didn't hear from Yvette Cooper any commitment to holding a new inquiry. She was instead really stressing the importance of implementing the recommendations of Alexis Jay's inquiry, so clearly trying to move on and show willingness that they are going to implement these recommendations.
But that really is Elon Musk being able to pressure the government into finally moving on one of the recommendations of the Jay report.
I think Alexis Jay has been keen not to take sides or been drawn into the politicisation of this row, but she herself has suggested it is correct that this process does appear to have been sped up in recent days. And I'm sure she would celebrate the fact that the 20 recommendations she made more than 2 years ago are now starting to be put into action.
There has been a lot of criticism for Musk's methods in being able to effect change. And they haven't just come from this country. Just describe the reaction across Europe.
It's been quite extraordinary, really, because Elon Musk has provably been expanding his interests and interference in other countries' politics for some weeks now.
Elon Musk has also actively sought to meddle in Germany's domestic politics. With fresh elections scheduled to take place in February, Musk publicly threw his weight behind the far-right AfD party.
And it's resulted in this almost coincidental backlash from a series of European leaders almost overnight. President Macron in France accused Musk, without naming him, of trying to intervene directly in elections. And it almost reflects Elon Musk's attempts to insert himself more on the world stage by acting as a diplomatic figure engaged in foreign affairs rather than somebody who is supposed to be looking at sort of government efficiency within the US government and bureaucratic systems.
And in the tidal wave of criticism that's come from world leaders for what Musk is up to, even though they don't name him, is there a sense that they're having to tiptoe around their criticism because he's so close to Donald Trump?
I think that's absolutely right. There is a real reluctance to meet strength with strength when it comes to Donald Trump. So they don't want to necessarily sort of inflame tensions with him, particularly when there's the threat of punitive tariffs being put on goods imported to the US as part of Donald Trump's America First strategy. I suppose the biggest difference between the second Trump presidency and the first is that we have the world's richest man who owns a social media platform seeming to dictate so much by way of the UK's national conversation. And during the first Trump administration, pre-existing relationships had been built by the mechanics of the institutions that sort of smooth over tensions between politicians and enable difficulties to sort of flare up and be resolved between governments. Elon Musk seems to have no filter, and his sort of universal application of free speech extending to the political realm has really serious ramifications for how the UK can respond. We saw that over the Southport murders, riots over the summer, and really this could be the tip of the iceberg. I think the only solace for the government in the UK is that some people think that the relationship between Elon Musk and Donald Trump will not survive 4 years, and that Donald Trump will not like having to share the limelight with somebody who is almost becoming bigger than him.
That was the chief political correspondent for The Times, Aubrey Allegretti, and you can follow all the coverage of this story at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Emily Webb and Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Ford, sound design was by David Crackles, and theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.